Not every battle in Vietnam was fought in the open. Some of the most brutal, most decisive operations of the entire war happened in secret. Black operations, missions that Washington denied. Men who were told, if you're captured, we never sent you. These were the special operations soldiers, the SEAL teams, the Green Berets, the units whose names never appeared in the official reports. They fought in the jungles of Laos on rivers that didn't exist on any military map against enemies that outnumbered them 10 to 1. Some of them pulled off the impossible. Some of them didn't come home. This documentary brings together 5 of the most intense, most secret, most forgotten operations of the Vietnam War. Operations that the government buried. Missions that history almost erased completely. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists for one reason: to tell the stories that history forgot. If that matters to you, hit subscribe and leave a like. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to keeping these stories alive. Now, if you've never heard what really happened in Vietnam's secret war, you're about to find out. This is far more brutal than anything you've been told. These men were asked to do the impossible.
The battle America forgot the Vietnam War had been raging for years. By 1969, American soldiers had been fighting for 4 long years, facing harsh jungles, brutal enemies, and a war that seemed to have no end. Back home, the American public was growing tired of the conflict. The horrifying images of young men dying in the jungles of Vietnam flooded newspapers and television screens. People were angry. Protests spread across the country. One battle in particular shocked the nation: the Battle of Hamburger Hill. It was a bloody fight over a hill that had no real strategic value. 72 American soldiers died, and many more were wounded. The battle became a symbol of the war's brutality and senselessness. But what if I told you that, at the very same time, another battle was taking place just 100 miles south of Hamburger Hill? A battle just as brutal, if not worse. A battle that lasted 4 long weeks. A battle where American soldiers were pushed to their absolute limits, facing an enemy that seemed to never run out of men, bullets, or bombs. Unlike Hamburger Hill, this battle was kept a secret. The government didn't want more outrage from the American people. The soldiers who fought there were left forgotten, their sacrifices unknown to the world. This is the story of the Battle of Tam Kai, one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to life. Now let's dive into the battle that history tried to erase. By 1969, the Vietnam War was at a turning point. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had become stronger, more organized, and more determined than ever. The Americans were struggling to win, and back home, public support for the war was collapsing. One of the most dangerous areas in Vietnam was Quangtin province, located just 40 miles south of Da Nang. This region was crucial because it connected North and South Vietnam. Whoever controlled this province could control the movement of troops and supplies. The U.S. American division responsible for defending this area was already stretched thin. But in early May 1969, something even worse happened. The NVA secretly moved 2 full regiments into the province. These were battle-hardened troops, highly trained and ready to fight. The American division had no idea what was coming. On May 12, 1969, the NVA launched a massive surprise attack. Within just 2 days, they took control of 80% of the province. American bases, fire support zones, and landing zones were under siege. The American division was caught completely off guard. The attacks were fierce, and the Americans struggled to hold their ground. One of the hardest hit areas was Landing Zone Professional, a critical fire support base. It was defended by the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, but they were badly outnumbered and struggling to survive against relentless enemy attacks. Realizing that the American division could not hold the province alone, the U.S. military called for reinforcements. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, saw the importance of the battle and reacted quickly. They ordered 2 battalions from the legendary 101st Airborne Division to be deployed to Quangtin Province. The operation was codenamed Operation Lamar Plain, and it would send the 101st Airborne into one of the toughest fights of the entire Vietnam War. But the men of the 101st Airborne Division had no idea what they were walking into. They were about to face some of the most intense jungle warfare of the entire conflict, one that history would later forget. The battle begins May 12 to 14, 1969. On May 12, 1969, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a powerful surprise attack in Quangtin province. They struck with overwhelming force, targeting key American bases, fire support locations, and landing zones. The attack was fast, brutal, and well-planned. Within just 2 days, the NVA had taken control of 80% of the province. American forces, caught completely off guard, struggled to fight back. The American division, responsible for defending the area, was quickly losing ground. The situation was becoming desperate. One of the hardest-hit locations was Landing Zone, LZ Professional, a critical fire support base defended by the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment. The NVA focused heavy attacks on this base, knowing that if they took it, they could completely cut off American forces in the region. The U.S. soldiers at LZ Professional were trapped, running low on ammunition and facing constant mortar and machine gun fire. Realizing they were on the verge of losing the province, American commanders knew they needed help, fast. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, immediately called for reinforcements. Their answer? The 101st Airborne Division, one of the most elite and battle-hardened units in Vietnam. On May 14, 1969, 2 battalions from the 101st Airborne were ordered to deploy to Quangtin province under Operation Lamar Plain. Their mission was clear: stop the NVA, rescue their fellow soldiers, and take back control of the province. The units chosen for this dangerous task were 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, 1st Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment. Additionally, the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment, already fighting in the area, would be attached to the task force. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were tough and experienced, having already fought in some of the war's most intense battles. But when they landed in Quangtin province, they had no idea that they were walking into one of the deadliest battles of their entire deployment. They were about to face weeks of relentless combat, brutal heat, and an enemy that refused to back down. The Battle of Tam Kai had begun. 4. Arrival of the 101st Airborne Division, May 15, 1969. The 101st Airborne Division was one of the most skilled and battle-hardened units in the U.S. Army. By 1969, they had already proven themselves in some of the toughest battles of the Vietnam War, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them in Quangtin province. On May 15, 1969, the first wave of 101st Airborne soldiers arrived in the province. They landed in large CH-47 Chinook helicopters, carrying only the most essential supplies, ammunition, weapons, and a few rations. Due to the urgency of the situation, their heavier gear, food, and vehicles were scheduled to arrive later by truck and jeep. There was no time to rest. The moment their boots touched the ground, the paratroopers were thrown into combat. Their first task was reconnaissance in force, moving through the jungle to locate enemy positions and attack them head-on. The 1st Battalion of the 501st Infantry Regiment was assigned to patrol near Landing Zone Professional, where the heaviest fighting was taking place. They were ordered to push forward, clear enemy bunkers, and rescue trapped soldiers from the American Division. The men quickly realized that this was not like their previous battles. The terrain was harsh, hot, and unforgiving. The thick jungle, high humidity, and scorching sun made every movement exhausting. The soldiers were already suffering from dehydration and fatigue, but they had no choice but to keep moving. Adding to the danger was the unpredictability of the enemy. The NVA had spent years building an elaborate system of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden spider holes throughout the region. These underground networks allowed them to move unseen, ambush American patrols, and disappear before airstrikes could hit them. Over the next few days, the 101st Airborne pushed deeper into enemy territory. They encountered abandoned NVA huts, hidden weapons caches, and the occasional sniper fire. But the main force of the enemy was still nowhere to be found. But the soldiers knew one thing: the enemy was out there, waiting, and soon enough they would make their presence known in the most brutal way possible. The Battle for Hill 187, May 21st, 1969. For days, the 101st Airborne Division had been patrolling the dense jungles of Quangtin province, searching for the enemy. The heat was unbearable. Supplies were running low, and the soldiers were exhausted. But on May 21st, 1969, they finally found what they were looking for, or rather, the enemy found them. Intelligence reports warned of a large enemy presence near Hill 187, a heavily forested ridge that overlooked key American positions. 3 companies from the 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta companies, were sent to investigate. They were accompanied by a recon platoon whose job was to scout ahead and locate the enemy. As they moved toward Hill 187, the recon platoon and Bravo company suddenly came under heavy fire. The NVA had dug in and were waiting for them. Enemy soldiers fired from hidden bunkers, spider holes, and tree lines using AK-47s, mortars, and a powerful 12.7mm machine gun that pinned the Americans down. The Americans were in an open area with little cover, making them easy targets. For 30 minutes, they were unable to move, trapped by relentless enemy fire. Every time a soldier tried to lift his head, bullets whizzed past. Mortar rounds exploded all around them. The situation was critical. Charlie and Delta companies arrived just in time, forcing the NVA to withdraw temporarily. But this was only the beginning. Now that they knew where the enemy was hiding, the battalion received a new order. Take the hill. Advancing up Hill 187 would be a nightmare. The NVA had fortified their bunkers using stone walls, giving them a major advantage. Every American advance was met with machine gun fire, grenades, and mortar shells. Worse still, the enemy used underground tunnels to move between bunkers, reinforcing positions even after they had been cleared. American soldiers would take out one bunker, only to be ambushed from behind by enemy soldiers emerging from hidden tunnels. The battle turned into a brutal, close-quarters fight. Soldiers had to rely on grenades, suppressive fire, and bayonets to clear out enemy positions. The 101st Airborne was determined to push forward, but casualties were mounting, and the battle was far from over. 6. The heroism of Sergeant Santiago Eravia. Amid the chaos and bloodshed on Hill 187, one soldier's bravery stood out. Sergeant Santiago Eravia, a radio telephone operator in Charlie Company. His courage under fire would not only save the lives of his fellow soldiers, but also earn him the Medal of Honor, though it would take 45 years for that recognition to come. As his platoon fought its way up the hill, Eravia was ordered to stay back and administer first aid to wounded soldiers. But as he moved between the injured men, he realized that the enemy had 4 machine gun bunkers positioned to wipe out his entire unit. His comrades were trapped, pinned down by relentless fire, and had no way to escape. Eravia had a choice: stay in cover or risk his life to save his fellow soldiers. He chose to fight. Arming himself with 2 M16 rifles, several hand grenades, and extra ammunition, Eravia crawled through the dirt and jungle brush toward the first bunker. Under heavy fire, he threw a grenade inside, taking out the enemy soldiers inside. Without hesitation, he sprinted to the next bunker, using his 2 rifles to lay down suppressive fire. He repeated this process 4 times, eliminating every machine gun position on the hill. His fearless assault saved his platoon from being wiped out and allowed the 101st Airborne to continue their attack. Despite his heroism, Eravia's actions went unrecognized for decades. It wasn't until 2014, 45 years later, that he was finally awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. His story is just one example of the incredible courage displayed by the soldiers of the 101st Airborne during the Battle of Tam Kai. But the fight for Hill 187 was far from over. The enemy wasn't done yet. 7. Continuing combat, Hill 187 and Hill 376, late May, early June 1969. Despite Sergeant Santiago Eravia's incredible heroism, the battle for Hill 187 was far from over. The 101st Airborne Division had managed to gain ground, but the NVA wasn't backing down. The fight continued with relentless attacks, brutal ambushes, and heavy casualties. As the sun set on May 21, 1969, American forces finally managed to secure a part of Hill 187, but the price was high: 12 men killed and 49 wounded. Yet the enemy was still out there. The NVA troops had not completely retreated. Instead, they had pulled back to a massive bunker complex at the hill's summit, waiting for another chance to strike. The next day, U.S. commanders made a tough decision. Rather than losing more men in direct assaults, they called in airstrikes. 3 250-pound bombs were dropped directly onto the enemy bunkers. The powerful explosions sent shockwaves through the jungle, collapsing tunnels and forcing the remaining NVA troops to flee. Hill 187 was finally under American control, but the battle wasn't over. The NVA wasn't just defending one hill, they controlled the entire region. As the 101st Airborne pushed forward, they encountered more heavily defended enemy positions. The next major battle took place at Hill 376, where another NVA stronghold was waiting for them. On June 2, 1969, the 1st Battalion, 501st Infantry Regiment, moved toward Hill 376. Just as before, the NVA was waiting. This time, an 18-man platoon from the 2nd Squadron, 17th Cavalry Regiment got pinned down by a much larger enemy force. For 7 straight days, the Americans fought to take Hill 376. The battle was just as intense as Hill 187, with soldiers facing a constant barrage of machine gun fire, mortars, and grenades. Once again, the enemy used tunnels and spider holes to launch surprise attacks, appearing behind American positions before vanishing underground. The fighting reached its peak on June 9th. At dawn, Delta Company woke up to the sound of enemy mortar shells raining down on their position. Luckily, the bombardment was inaccurate, causing no casualties. But the attack was just the beginning. Reconnaissance reports indicated a large-scale enemy assault was coming. As expected, hundreds of NVA soldiers charged up the hill, firing everything they had at the Americans. Delta Company was in danger of being overrun. The air cavalry came just in time. American helicopters and fighter jets arrived, unleashing devastating firepower that broke the enemy's advance. With air support and heavy artillery, the soldiers of the 101st were able to hold the line. But just as the battle seemed to be ending, disaster struck, a friendly fire incident. An American airstrike mistakenly hit Bravo Company, causing more casualties. Despite this tragedy, the soldiers continued their mission, determined to defeat the NVA. By June 12, 1969, the exhausted men of the 101st Airborne were finally relieved from Hill 376. Another brutal battle had ended, but the war was far from over. 8. The final push and conclusion of Operation Lamar Plain. August 1969. After weeks of brutal combat at Hill 187 and Hill 376, the 101st Airborne Division was exhausted. The men had fought in intense heat, with little rest, low supplies, and constant enemy ambushes. But their mission wasn't over yet. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, had suffered heavy losses, but they were not completely defeated. Instead of fighting in large battles, they began splitting into smaller units, retreating into the dense jungles of Quangtin province. They avoided direct engagements and instead relied on hit-and-run attacks, booby traps, and sniper fire. American commanders realized that continuing the same tactics wouldn't work. Instead of launching more assaults on enemy-held hills, they changed their strategy. The mission now focused on tracking down the scattered NVA forces and destroying their supply routes. For the next 2 months, the 101st Airborne carried out constant patrols and search missions. The jungle was filled with dangers, not just enemy snipers, but also hidden bunkers, traps, and underground tunnels. The enemy had built an entire network of hospitals, storage facilities, and living quarters beneath the jungle floor. One of the largest discoveries was made near Fire Support Base Boxer, where soldiers uncovered an extensive system of enemy bunkers and tunnels. Inside, they found weapons, medical supplies, and even makeshift classrooms where the NVA had trained new recruits. These findings proved just how well prepared the enemy was and why the battle had been so difficult. By August 11, 1969, the U.S. military decided it was time to end Operation Lamar Plain. The 101st Airborne had pushed the NVA out of Quangtin province, and the remaining enemy forces had retreated into the mountains. One by one, American units boarded helicopters, trucks, and transport planes, heading back to their base at LZ Sally. Finally, on August 14, 1969, at 8 a.m., Operation Lamar plane was officially declared over. In total, 126 American soldiers were killed and 444 were wounded, a higher death toll than the famous Battle of Hamburger Hill. Yet, despite their sacrifices, very few people knew about this battle. It had been overshadowed by other events, and many of the fallen soldiers' families were even told their loved ones had died at Hamburger Hill instead of Tam Kai. The battle may have been forgotten by history, but the soldiers of the 101st Airborne never forgot. 9. The aftermath and historical neglect. The Battle of Tam Kai was one of the deadliest and most grueling fights of the Vietnam War. 126 American soldiers were killed and 444 were wounded, more than the infamous Battle of Hamburger Hill. But while Hamburger Hill became a symbol of the war's brutality, Tam Kai was largely forgotten. Why? The answer lies in the timing and secrecy surrounding the battle. At the same time as Tam Kai, the media was focused on Hamburger Hill. The American public was outraged by the heavy losses over a hill with little strategic value. Anti-war protests grew stronger, and politicians faced intense pressure to justify why American soldiers were still dying in Vietnam. The U.S. military understood that revealing another brutal, costly battle, just 100 miles south of Hamburger Hill, would only add fuel to the fire, so the battle was kept out of the headlines. Many families of the fallen were even told their loved ones had died at Hamburger Hill rather than at Tam Kai. For decades, Operation Lamar plane and the sacrifices of the 101st Airborne remained unknown to the public. Veterans who had survived the battle felt ignored and forgotten. Unlike other famous battles, there were no movies, books, or documentaries to tell their story. It wasn't until much later that historians began uncovering the truth about what happened at Tam Kai. Veterans started sharing their experiences, and records from the battle were finally examined. In 2014, one of the heroes of Tam Kai, Sergeant Santiago Eravia, finally received the Medal of Honor nearly 45 years after his bravery on the battlefield. But despite these efforts, the Battle of Tam Kai still remains unknown to most Americans. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division fought with unmatched courage and determination. They endured weeks of relentless combat, surviving against impossible odds. Their sacrifices deserve to be remembered, not just by historians, but by everyone who values the bravery of those who serve. Their story should never be forgotten. The Battle of Tam Kai was one of the most brutal and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. The soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division fought through weeks of relentless jungle warfare, facing an enemy that was well-prepared, deeply entrenched, and willing to fight to the death. They battled through Hill 187, Hill 376, and countless ambushes, suffering from extreme heat, exhaustion, and heavy casualties. The enemy used underground tunnels, surprise attacks, and brutal close-quarters combat, making every day a fight for survival. Yet despite everything, the 101st Airborne never gave up. They pushed forward, adapted their strategy, and ultimately drove the North Vietnamese army out of Quangtin province. But their sacrifice was never truly recognized. While the world remembers Hamburger Hill, Tam Kai remains forgotten, hidden in the shadows of history. The soldiers who fought and died there were denied the honor they deserved. Many of their families were misled, never knowing the true story of their loved one's final battle. Even decades later, the battle remains largely unknown. Few books or documentaries tell the story. Veterans who survived carried the memories of their fallen brothers, but the world moved on. It's time to change that. The men of the 101st Airborne Division displayed unmatched bravery, resilience, and sacrifice. Their fight was not for recognition, but for their comrades and their duty. Now it is our responsibility to honor their memory. The Battle of Tam Kai deserves to be remembered, not just as another fight in the Vietnam War, but as a testament to the courage and endurance of American soldiers. Their story should be told, their sacrifices honored, and their legacy preserved. If you found this story important, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with others. More people need to know about the forgotten heroes of the 101st Airborne Division. Thank you for watching. In the darkness of the South China Sea, just miles off the coast of North Vietnam, a U.S. Navy submarine floats silently beneath the surface. On board, a team of Navy SEALs prepares for a mission unlike any other. It's top secret, it's high risk, and almost no one in the military knows what they're about to do. Their target isn't a military base, it's not a weapon site, it's something far more important, a group of American prisoners of war held deep inside enemy territory. These men are planning a daring escape from the infamous Hanoi Hilton, and they'll need help if they're going to survive the journey home. The plan is bold, the mission is dangerous, and the story that follows would stay buried for decades. This is Operation Thunderhead, the last secret rescue mission of the Vietnam War. It was a mission built on courage, technology, and silence. And when it went wrong, it went tragically wrong. The U.S. government kept it quiet. The families of the men involved were given no answers. And one Navy SEAL would become the final combat casualty of a war that was supposed to be ending. This story remained classified for nearly 40 years. But now it can finally be told. Before we begin, if you enjoy deep dive history and real stories of bravery that were kept in the shadows, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. It helps bring attention to the forgotten missions and the heroes who never came home. Let's go back to 1972. The Vietnam War is in its final stages. Peace talks are underway. But behind enemy lines, American prisoners are preparing to run for their lives. And far offshore, a submarine is waiting in the dark to bring them home. By 1972, the Vietnam War had dragged on for more than a decade. Most American combat troops were already leaving the country. The war was shifting toward diplomacy, with peace talks happening in Paris. But for hundreds of Americans held prisoner in North Vietnam, there was still no way out. These prisoners had been locked up for years. Many were tortured, starved, and kept in brutal isolation. The most feared prison was Hoa Lo, known to the world as the Hanoi Hilton. That's where a group of American pilots had been quietly planning their escape. One of them was Air Force Captain John Dramisi. He had already tried to escape once, in 1969. He was caught, beaten, and nearly killed. But he didn't stop thinking about trying again. This time, he wasn't going to do it alone. Along with fellow POWs, including Captain George McKnight and Navy Lieutenant George Coker, he came up with a plan that was incredibly risky, but just might work. They believed that if they could break out of the prison, they could follow the Red River all the way to the Gulf of Tonkin. From there, they hoped a U.S. ship or aircraft could pick them up. They didn't ask for a rescue force to come in. They just needed someone to be there when they reached the coast. Somehow, the plan made it out. A coded message was hidden in a letter home, smuggled past censors, and passed through a POW support group in the United States. It eventually reached the Pentagon. The men inside Hoa Lo were asking for help, and they were planning to move soon. At that point, everything changed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moore, personally approved a rescue mission, but it had to be quiet. No leaks, no headlines. With peace talks hanging in the balance, even a whisper of a rescue mission could trigger a political disaster. The operation would be handled in total secrecy. It would be small, fast, and silent. The goal to position elite U.S. forces near the Red River Delta, close enough to intercept the escaping prisoners without alerting the enemy. The name for this mission was Operation Thunderhead. It would involve submarines, mini-submarines, helicopters, and some of the Navy's most highly trained men, including a SEAL team chosen for their skill and experience. The planning moved quickly. The escape was expected in early June. That gave them just weeks to prepare and get into position. To signal the prisoners that the mission was approved, 2 U.S. Air Force SR-71 Blackbird spy planes were flown directly over Hanoi. They broke the sound barrier, causing a massive double sonic boom heard throughout the city. It was a message only the POWs would understand. The escape plan was a go. Operation Thunderhead would be America's final covert attempt to rescue prisoners during the Vietnam War. It was a mission built on hope and trust, the hope that the prisoners could escape and the trust that someone would be there to bring them home. But war is never that simple, and what happened next would turn Thunderhead from a secret rescue into a deadly disaster. Operation Thunderhead had a single purpose: to be in the right place at the right time. If the prisoners reached the coast, American forces would be there to pull them out before the enemy could stop them. But to make that possible, the Navy had to build a mission that could operate deep inside enemy territory, without being seen, heard, or exposed. The job would be given to a small group of men and machines. At the center of the plan was the USS Grayback, a specially modified submarine that could carry both people and equipment for underwater operations. Grayback had been designed for missions just like this: silent, hidden, and deadly. On board was a group of Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 1, Alpha Platoon. The team leader was Lieutenant Melvin Spence Dry, a quiet but determined officer with combat experience. He would lead the main recovery force. One of his top men was Warrant Officer Philip Moki Martin, a respected SEAL known for keeping calm under pressure. Supporting them were underwater specialists from Underwater Demolition Team 11, or UDT-11. They were experts in using small submarines called SEAL Delivery Vehicles, or SDVs. These were electric-powered, open-cockpit mini-subs designed to carry SEALs underwater for miles. The SDVs would launch from Grayback and carry the men close to shore. Above the surface, the Navy assembled a small task force. The nuclear-powered cruiser USS Long Beach would act as a command ship. A support ship, USS Harold E. Holt, joined the group. 2 Navy helicopters from Squadron HC-7 were assigned to fly night missions along the coast. These aircraft could be used for extraction if the SEALs or prisoners needed to be picked up fast. Even within the Navy, most people had no idea what this operation was really about. To keep things secret, commanders were told a cover story that they were helping to recover North Vietnamese defectors. The real goal was known only to a few top officers. One of the most unusual parts of the plan involved how the SEALs would return to the submarine. If things went well, helicopters would drop them back into the ocean, and they would dive down to the submerged Grayback. It was a difficult and dangerous maneuver, especially at night, but it was seen as the safest way to rejoin the sub without surfacing near enemy waters. The escape itself was expected in early June. Intelligence said the POWs might try to move under cover of heavy storms, when power would go out in the prison and guards would be less alert. Timing would be critical. If the SEALs were too early, they could be spotted. If they were too late, the prisoners could be captured or killed. To prepare, the SEALs and UDT teams trained hard in the Philippines and at sea. Most of them had never worked together before. Some had never used an SDV in real operations, but there was no time to wait. By late May, the task force was in position off the coast of North Vietnam. Grayback moved into the area silently and submerged. The helicopters began flying surveillance runs at night. The men on board didn't talk much. They knew what was at stake. Operation Thunderhead was ready to begin. The rescuers were in place. All they needed now was for the prisoners to make their move. On the night of June 3, 1972, the USS Grayback sat on the ocean floor, just a few miles off the coast of North Vietnam. The submarine had gone silent, waiting for the right moment to launch the SEALs. The plan was to send in a small reconnaissance team first. They would land on a small island near the mouth of the Red River and watch for signs of escaping prisoners. Lieutenant Spence Dry led the first team. With him were Warrant Officer Moki Martin and 2 UDT operators, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Lutz and Petty Officer Thomas Edwards. The 4 men loaded into a Mark 7 SEAL delivery vehicle and launched into the dark waters. The ride was immediately more difficult than expected. They had planned for calm conditions. Instead, they faced strong currents flowing out of the river. The SDV, a small battery-powered sub, wasn't strong enough to fight against the flow. It moved slowly, draining its power just to stay on course. After more than an hour, the team realized they weren't going to make it to the island. The SDV's battery was dying. If they kept going, they risked being stranded near shore, or worse, being discovered. Lieutenant Dry made the call. They aborted the mission, but now they had a problem. The SDV didn't have enough power to get back to the submarine. The men were adrift in the open sea. They couldn't leave the SDV behind either. If the enemy found it, the mission would be exposed. They used a small radio to send out a distress code. A Navy helicopter from the USS Long Beach flew out at dawn. It spotted the disabled SDV and destroyed it with gunfire to make sure it couldn't be recovered. Then it lifted the 4 men out of the water and returned them to the cruiser. But the USS Greyback, still underwater and on radio silence, had no idea any of this had happened. The sub was still waiting for them to return. By the evening of June 4th, the second SDV team was ready to launch. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Conger, Ensign Tom McGrath, and 2 more UDT men prepared to follow the original plan. Not knowing the mission had already changed, they left Greyback and began heading toward shore. That same night, the Navy decided to return Lieutenant Dry and his original team to the submarine. With enemy patrol boats nearby and weather worsening, they had to move fast. The plan was risky. A Navy helicopter would fly them back into the sea, and they would jump into the water near the submarine. Then, using infrared beacons and lights, they would locate Greyback and dive down to re-enter it. This kind of drop had never been done under combat conditions. Dry and Martin explained the maneuver to the helicopter crew. They stressed how important it was to fly low and slow, no more than 20 feet above the water. Any higher, and the impact could be deadly. In the middle of the night, the helicopter took off from the USS Long Beach with 4 men on board: Dry, Martin, Lutz, and Edwards. The seas were rough. There was no moonlight. Wind was pushing hard from behind. Somewhere in the darkness, they saw a faint, blinking infrared light in the water. It was supposed to be Greyback's signal. They approached it, unsure. The pilot held position, and one by one, the men jumped. The signal was not from Greyback. It was from the second SDV team, who had also been forced to surface after their submersible failed. Lieutenant Spence Dry hit the water hard. Too hard. The jump had been from too high and too fast. He died instantly on impact. The other 2, Lutz and Edwards, were badly injured. Martin was the only one who landed safely. In the water, disoriented and exhausted, Martin realized what had happened. He swam through the dark and found the others, trying to keep them alive and together. The second team, Conger and the rest, had also surfaced nearby. Their SDV had flooded and stopped working. They had been floating on the surface for hours, hoping someone would find them. Now both teams were in the same spot, drifting in the sea, miles from shore, in enemy waters, with patrol boats nearby. They could hear the engines of Vietnamese gunboats in the distance. By dawn on June 5th, they had found the body of Lieutenant Dry and tied it securely so it wouldn't drift away. Martin, injured and cold, refused to leave him behind. A rescue helicopter arrived just after sunrise. It picked up all surviving members of both teams and recovered Dry's remains. The operation was officially over. The second SDV was never recovered. Both submersibles had been lost. The SEALs had never reached the shore. The prisoners had never escaped. And Operation Thunderhead had failed. Unbeknownst to everyone on the mission, the escape from the Hanoi Hilton had already been canceled. The senior American officer in the prison had called it off, fearing the prisoners would be killed if the attempt failed. But that decision never reached the men waiting offshore. The SEALs had gone in to rescue men who were no longer coming. It was a mission built on silence, courage, and trust. But it ended in darkness, confusion, and loss. Lieutenant Spence Dry became the last Navy SEAL killed during the Vietnam War, and no one outside the operation would know the truth, not for decades. After the rescue, the surviving SEALs and UDT members were flown back to the USS Long Beach. Some were treated for serious injuries. Others were shaken, but physically unharmed. All of them were exhausted. The mood on board was quiet. Everyone knew the mission had gone terribly wrong. Lieutenant Spence Dry was gone. He had jumped from the helicopter into the sea, trying to get back to his team, trying to finish the job. His body had been recovered, but the cost of that moment would stay with his men for the rest of their lives. On the USS Greyback, the crew finally received word of what had happened. The submarine had remained underwater, keeping radio silence and waiting for the team to return. Now it was clear the mission was over. Greyback's commander offered to continue the operation if the team could be reassembled. He was willing to surface and launch another attempt using inflatable boats instead of the SDVs, but it was already too late. A tropical storm, Typhoon Aura, was moving into the area. The seas were becoming too rough for any further insertions. With the weather closing in, Command made the decision to call off Operation Thunderhead completely. Over the next few days, all American forces withdrew from the area. The escape from the Hanoi Hilton never happened. Inside the prison, the senior officer had made the final call to cancel it. He believed that if even one man failed to get out, the guards would punish everyone. With peace talks showing progress, he decided the risk was too high. That decision likely saved lives. But the men offshore never knew. Back at sea, the Navy kept the mission quiet. Thunderhead was top secret. The men who had survived it were told not to speak about what happened. Even the families of those involved were kept in the dark. Lieutenant Dry's death was not listed as a combat loss. Officially, there was no record of what really happened. For years, the story of Operation Thunderhead remained hidden, buried in classified files, sealed under orders from the highest levels of the military. There were no headlines, no recognition, no closure. The mission had failed, not because of the men who carried it out, but because of things they couldn't control: bad weather, equipment failure, poor communication, and a change in plans they were never told about. Still, they had gone forward. They had followed orders. They had risked everything. And in the end, they had brought each other home. That was the quiet legacy of Operation Thunderhead, a mission no one was allowed to talk about until many years later. For decades, Operation Thunderhead remained in the shadows. The men who had taken part went back to their units or quietly left the service. No one was allowed to speak about what had happened. It was as if the mission had never existed. Lieutenant Spence Dry was buried with military honors, but the truth about his death was not made public. His family was told very little. His father, a retired Navy captain, spent years trying to learn what really happened. But the details were sealed. Even within the Navy, most people didn't know the story. The other SEALs and UDT operators who survived the mission were told to keep it quiet. They moved on with their careers, carrying the memory of what had happened in silence. But the memory didn't fade. Warrant Officer Moki Martin, who had survived the deadly drop, continued to serve in the SEALs. Later, after an unrelated injury left him paralyzed, he became a mentor to younger SEALs. He never forgot that night in 1972. The mission, the chaos, and the loss of his team leader. Like many of the men who were there, he always believed that the mission, even though it failed, had meaning. In 2008, 36 years after the operation, the U.S. government finally declassified Operation Thunderhead. The full details were released to the public. The secrecy was lifted. With that, the Navy finally recognized the sacrifice of the men involved. Lieutenant Melvin Spence Dry was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star with V for Valor, recognizing his leadership and bravery during the mission. Warrant Officer Philip Moki Martin received the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device for helping save lives in the aftermath of the drop. A ceremony was held at the Naval Amphibious Base in Coronado, California. Survivors of the mission were present. Some were now older, walking with canes or sitting in wheelchairs, but they stood proud, finally able to honor their fallen teammate in public. Moki Martin accepted his medal with few words. He said he accepted it on behalf of all of Alpha Platoon, the SEALs who had trained and fought together, and the ones who didn't come back. For the families, it brought some closure. For the Navy, it was a long overdue correction. For the men involved, it was a moment to finally say out loud what they had carried for decades. Operation Thunderhead had remained hidden because of its failure. But when the truth came out, it was clear, failure or not, the mission was an example of courage, loyalty, and the quiet cost of war. It reminded everyone that not all heroes come home with medals. Some come home in silence, and some don't come home at all. Operation Thunderhead was one of the last covert missions of the Vietnam War. It was also one of the quietest. For decades, it lived in the shadows, not because of shame, but because of secrecy. A mission so sensitive, so carefully hidden, that even those who risked their lives were told to stay silent. But silence doesn't erase sacrifice. The men who took part in Operation Thunderhead were prepared to give everything for a group of fellow Americans they'd never met. They trusted their mission, their team, and their training, even when the odds turned against them. They didn't know the prisoners would never escape. They didn't know their equipment would fail. They didn't know they'd be dropped into the wrong part of the sea. and they didn't know that one of them wouldn't survive the night. But they went anyway. They pushed forward in total darkness, underwater and under fire, because that's what they were trained to do. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because the job had to be done. When it ended, there was no parade, no headlines, just a line in a report that wouldn't be seen for 36 years. But history remembers them now. Lieutenant Spence Dry's name is etched into the Navy SEAL Memorial Wall, the last SEAL to die in combat during the Vietnam War. His team, Alpha Platoon, is remembered for their bravery and their loyalty, not just to each other, but to the men they tried to save. Today, Special Operations Forces train with better gear, better communication, and more support. But the lessons from Thunderhead still matter. The mission showed what happens when courage meets chaos, when a perfect plan meets an imperfect world. It proved that even a mission that fails can be filled with honor. And in the end, it left behind something stronger than silence. A story that speaks of duty, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that doesn't need to be seen to be real. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone else hear about the men of Operation Thunderhead. Let their names and their effort be remembered. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay respectful, and never forget the cost of war. Before sunrise, 2,000 Viet Cong soldiers moved through the dark jungle. Their target? A small hill with just 20 Americans and 120 South Vietnamese troops. What happened next became one of the most intense and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. This is the story of the Battle of Song Bay, a battle that tested courage, skill, and raw survival. A battle that started with a surprise attack and ended with hand-to-hand combat in the streets. Most people have never heard of Song Bay, but in May 1965, it was nearly wiped off the map. The Viet Cong launched a massive surprise assault on this remote provincial capital, hoping to raise their flag and hold the town. For a few hours, they succeeded, but the defenders didn't break. Outnumbered more than 10 to 1, a handful of U.S. Special Forces soldiers, South Vietnamese Rangers, and a few local tanks held their ground. They didn't just survive. They fought back, retook the town, and sent the enemy fleeing into the jungle. In this video, we'll break down how it happened, the tactics, the bravery, and the aftermath. You'll see how a forgotten battle helped shape the future of the entire Vietnam War. If you enjoy stories of true courage, battlefield history, and military strategy, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. In early 1965, the Vietnam War was changing. The Viet Cong were growing bolder. These communist fighters had already won major battles in the countryside. In places like Binh Diem, they had defeated well-trained South Vietnamese forces. They weren't just ambushing patrols anymore. They were launching full-scale attacks, sometimes with thousands of soldiers. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese army, known as the ARVN, was struggling. Corruption, poor leadership, and low morale had weakened their fighting power. Some soldiers deserted, others didn't trust their commanders. It was a dangerous time. America was watching closely. At this point, the United States had not yet fully entered the war with combat troops, but they had sent thousands of advisors, pilots, and special forces. These Americans trained and supported the South Vietnamese, hoping to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. One of those remote areas was Phuoc Long Province, near the Cambodian border. Its capital was a small, quiet town called Song Bay. It had dirt roads, a market, and a small military outpost. It wasn't famous. It wasn't even that well defended, but the Viet Cong saw it as the perfect target. In April 1965, a team of U.S. Green Berets from Special Forces Detachment B-34 arrived in Song Bay. They joined a handful of American advisors already working with local ARVN forces. Together, they began building a fortified camp on a small hill overlooking the town. Sandbags, bunkers, barbed wire. They were preparing for something, and they were right to. Unbeknownst to them, 2 full Viet Cong regiments were already moving into position. They were planning a massive assault to capture the town, kill the defenders, and send a clear message. No place in South Vietnam was safe. This wasn't going to be a small firefight in the jungle. This was going to be a battle. It was still dark when the first mortar shells fell on Song Bay. The time was 1:45 in the morning. May 10, 1965. The defenders had no warning. No radio call, no scout reports. Just silence. Then explosions. The Viet Cong had arrived, and they didn't come quietly. Over 2,000 communist fighters from the 271st and 272nd Regiments had surrounded the town. They were well armed with mortars, flamethrowers, and heavy machine guns. They had trained for this assault and knew exactly where to strike. Their plan was brutal and simple: hit hard, hit fast, and overwhelm the defenders before sunrise. Mortar rounds slammed into the ARVN outpost and the American Special Forces camp on the hill. Then came the small arms fire, machine guns, AK-47s, and even RPGs. Sappers, Viet Cong combat engineers, crawled through the wire, carrying explosives to blow open the perimeter. Inside the hilltop compound, about 20 Green Berets and U.S. Army advisors held their ground with 120 South Vietnamese troops, local militia, regional forces, and a few aging M24 tanks. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The defenders scrambled into their bunkers and returned fire with everything they had. Light machine guns rattled from behind sandbags. Flares lit up the night sky. Tracers painted red lines across the jungle. At one point, Viet Cong fighters reached the outer bunkers. The battle became close and personal. Rifles at 10 feet, grenades thrown over walls, some soldiers even fighting hand-to-hand. Inside the town below, it was worse. The Viet Cong swept through the streets, capturing buildings, destroying communication posts, and pushing local defenders out. They raised their flag over government buildings, a chilling symbol that they had taken Song Bay. For several hours, it looked like they had won, but the hill still held. The American-led compound just outside the town refused to fall. Special Forces soldiers like Staff Sergeant Horace Young and SP4 Johnny Culbreth fought fiercely, calling in fire support, coordinating defenses, and refusing to leave their posts. As dawn approached, the defenders were running low on ammunition, but they still had control of the hill. And with daylight came something the Viet Cong feared: American air power. The battle for Song Bay was far from over. In fact, it was about to turn. As the sun began to rise over Song Bay, the jungle fog still clung to the ground. Smoke from burning buildings drifted across the town. The smell of gunpowder was everywhere. But with daylight came new hope. American helicopter gunships, the famous Hueys, were now airborne. They circled above the town, ready to fire rockets and machine guns at the enemy below. But there was a problem. Thick fog and low clouds made it hard to see anything. The pilots couldn't tell who was friendly and who was Viet Cong. Down below, the defenders were still locked in combat. The Green Berets and ARVN troops on the hill were holding out, but barely. Ammunition was running low. Medics worked nonstop. The wounded were piling up, and helicopters couldn't land under enemy fire. Then the situation got worse. The Viet Cong had placed 50 caliber machine guns around the town, powerful enough to shoot down helicopters. Every time a medevac tried to land, those guns opened fire. Several choppers were forced to pull away. It was time to bring in the big guns. By late morning, the fog finally began to lift. That's when U.S. Air Force F-4 Phantoms arrived overhead. These jets were fast, loud, and deadly. With the help of American advisors on the ground, the Phantoms dropped cluster bombs directly onto the enemy gun positions. The explosions were massive. Whole sections of enemy fire went silent. One by one, the .50 caliber nests were destroyed. Now at last, helicopters could land. They evacuated the wounded and dropped off fresh ammunition. The tide was beginning to turn, but retaking the town wouldn't be easy. The Viet Cong still controlled most of Song Bay, and they weren't going to give it up without a fight. That job would fall to South Vietnam's toughest warriors, the ARVN Rangers. The counterattack. At noon on May 10th, while smoke still rose from the town, the ground began to shake again. But this time, it wasn't the Viet Cong. It was the sound of ARVN Ranger boots hitting the ground. The 36th Ranger Battalion, South Vietnam's elite light infantry, had arrived. These weren't ordinary troops. They were trained for jungle warfare, raids, and brutal combat. Their job was simple: take back Song Bay. And they didn't waste a second. Instead of setting up slowly or waiting for reinforcements, The Rangers launched an immediate assault in broad daylight. They charged straight into the burning town from the south, pushing through ruined buildings and streets still crawling with Viet Cong. The Viet Cong weren't expecting this. They had just fought all night. Now they were facing an elite force coming at them fast, with guns blazing. The Rangers fought house to house, room to room. Grenades were thrown through windows. Rifle fire echoed down alleys. The streets became a maze of smoke, gunfire, and screams. In many places, the battle was so close that soldiers couldn't use their rifles. Some Rangers drew knives, machetes, even their bare hands. One South Vietnamese sergeant was seen leading his squad with a traditional combat blade, slashing through a wall to get to a hidden VC fighter. Another platoon cleared an entire building in less than 5 minutes, kicking down doors and dragging out enemy soldiers. As the 36th Rangers pushed through the center of town, a second elite unit arrived from the east, the 34th Ranger Battalion. Together, the two battalions launched a two-sided sweep, closing in on remaining enemy pockets and trapping them inside burning buildings and courtyards. It was chaos, but it was working. The Rangers moved like fire. They retook government buildings, destroyed enemy machine gun nests, and rescued trapped civilians. By nightfall, the Viet Cong knew they couldn't hold the town. What was supposed to be a quick victory had turned into a disaster for them. Their plan to capture Song Bay had failed. Now they were trying to escape. Many fled into the jungle under cover of darkness. Others were killed in the streets. Some left behind weapons and even wounded comrades. They couldn't afford to stay. By the end of the day, Song Bay was back in ARVN hands. The town was damaged. Fires still burned, but the flag had been lowered, and the people for now were safe. The Rangers had done what few thought possible. They had taken back a lost town through sheer speed, force, and courage, and they weren't done yet. The next morning, they would begin the hunt. The next morning, May 11th, the smoke still hung low over Song Bay. The battle was over, but the war in the area was not. The ARVN Rangers and local forces began sweeping the town and nearby jungle. They were looking for hidden Viet Cong fighters, recovering weapons, and checking for booby traps left behind. What they found was destruction. Blown-out buildings, burnt homes, and the bodies of both friend and foe. In and around the town, 85 Viet Cong were confirmed killed. Many more were believed wounded, but most had escaped into the dense jungle. Despite their heavy losses, the VC had managed to retreat in an organized way, proof of their discipline and training. Over the next 4 days, from May 11th to 15th, ARVN troops pushed outward, trying to track and destroy the retreating enemy. But the terrain was on the VC side. Thick forests, hidden trails, and the nearby Cambodian border made pursuit nearly impossible. On May 15th, just as the ARVN thought things were calming down, a Viet Cong ambush struck an ARVN convoy outside the town. Several soldiers were killed and vehicles were destroyed. It was a final act of defiance from an enemy that refused to vanish quietly. When the dust finally settled, the numbers told the story. The ARVN had lost 49 soldiers. The United States lost 5. Brave special forces and advisors who fought to the very end. Song Bay had survived, but the battle left deep scars, physical and emotional, on the soldiers and civilians who lived through it. And while the enemy had been pushed back, they were far from finished. In fact, they were already planning their next move. Behind the maps and strategies, the Battle of Song Bay was also a story of human bravery, of men who stood their ground when everything around them was falling apart. One of those men was Captain Henry Deutsch, a U.S. Army advisor with the MACV team. When the attack began, Deutsch could have evacuated, but he refused. He stayed with his South Vietnamese allies, helping coordinate airstrikes and rally troops inside the burning town. According to survivors, he radioed in targets even as bullets snapped past his head. He was later killed by shrapnel during the fighting. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. But to the men around him, he was more than a medal. He was a leader who refused to leave his post. On the hilltop, Special Forces Staff Sergeant Horace Young and SP4 Johnny Colbreth were among the first to fall. They were inside the fortified camp, directing defensive fire and manning radios as the enemy closed in. Young was hit by a mortar round, still at his station. Colbreth went down fighting in the dark. Both were remembered as calm under fire, brave to the end. The ARVN Rangers, too, wrote their own legend that day. These weren't conscripts or inexperienced soldiers. They were elite, and they fought like it. Some used knives and machetes in hand-to-hand combat, storming buildings filled with enemy fighters. One Ranger officer was said to carry a traditional Vietnamese blade into combat, leading the charge through smoke-filled alleys. There were also civilians, families who hid in basements or ditches through the night. One 12-year-old girl later said her family prayed the Rangers would come. When they did, they helped lead survivors to safety, even as bullets still flew overhead. After the battle, the Green Berets nicknamed their camp Little Dien Bien Phu. It was a nod to the famous French battle, but with a twist. This time, the defenders had won. These stories didn't make headlines. They weren't turned into movies, but for those who lived them, they were unforgettable. Song Bay wasn't just a battle, it was a stand. The Battle of Song Bay wasn't just a story of bravery. It was also a clear example of how both sides adapted, planned, and executed modern warfare in Vietnam. The Viet Cong used classic guerrilla tactics, but on a much larger scale. They weren't just harassing patrols or planting roadside bombs. This time, they committed 2 full regiments, over 2,000 fighters, to a direct assault on a provincial capital. That alone showed how bold and organized they had become by 1965. Their strategy was called hit the point, destroy the reinforcements. It meant attacking a key target, like Song Bay, and preparing ambushes to crush any counterattack. They used sappers to break through defenses, mortars to soften targets, and flamethrowers to clear buildings. They also placed .50 caliber machine guns in strategic spots to shoot down helicopters, something U.S. forces were relying on more and more. The plan nearly worked, but what stopped them was a combination of defensive preparation, air power, and elite counterattack forces. The Special Forces camp on the hill, built just weeks before, proved its value. With bunkers, barbed wire, and clear fields of fire, a small force of Americans and ARVN troops held off thousands. It bought time, and in Vietnam, time meant air support. When the fog cleared, U.S. jets and helicopters took control of the skies. Cluster bombs destroyed key enemy positions. Once the .50 cal guns were neutralized, helicopters could land, and the tide began to turn. The most decisive move came from the ARVN Rangers. These elite troops didn't wait. They attacked the town in daylight, using speed and aggression to surprise the Viet Cong. They fought up close, often room to room, using rifles, grenades, and sometimes even knives. What didn't work was pursuit. The Viet Cong escaped into the jungle in small groups, avoiding total destruction. This exposed a weakness in ARVN operations. They couldn't track or fight effectively at night. That failure led to a big change. After Song Bay, the U.S. created new MIKE forces. After months of setbacks and low morale, South Vietnamese Rangers showed that, with good leadership and proper support, they could take the fight to the enemy and win. Their quick counterattack, close quarters fighting, and refusal to back down became a source of pride. For the United States, the battle exposed both strengths and weaknesses. The combination of special forces, air power, and elite ARVN units worked. But the inability to stop the enemy from escaping showed a serious gap in strategy, especially at night. That led directly to the formation of MIKE forces, special mobile strike teams created to respond faster and chase down retreating enemies. Politically, Song Bay was a small but important moment. It reassured leaders in Saigon and Washington that South Vietnam still had fight left in it, but it also showed how fast the war was escalating. And there's a tragic twist to this story. Exactly 10 years later, in 1975, Phuoc Long Province, including Song Bay, was the first area to fall to the North Vietnamese in the final offensive. This time there were no U.S. forces, no air support, and no counterattack. In 1965, Song Bay was saved. In 1975, it marked the beginning of the end. The Battle of Song Bay was not the largest battle of the Vietnam War. It didn't involve thousands of American troops or make headlines around the world. But it mattered to the soldiers who fought it, to the commanders who studied it, and to the war that was just beginning to shift. It showed that the Viet Cong were willing to launch major attacks not just disappear into the jungle. And it proved that with the right leadership, the South Vietnamese army could hit back hard. It was a battle where 20 Americans and 120 South Vietnamese held the line against thousands. It was a battle where men like Captain Henry Deutsch, SSG Horace Young, and the brave ARVN Rangers refused to give up their ground, even when surrounded, outnumbered, and under fire from all sides. It was a turning point. Song Bay became a symbol, not just of defense, but of resilience. And even though it's rarely mentioned today, the lessons from that small town echoed throughout the war. Be ready, adapt fast, and never underestimate your enemy. If you found this story powerful, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten moments from military history. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And as always, remember the names, honor the courage, and learn from the past. We'll see you in the next one. February 1971. The jungles along the Laotian border were about to witness one of the most ambitious and disastrous operations of the entire Vietnam War. For years, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been the lifeline of the North Vietnamese war effort, a sprawling network of hidden jungle routes stretching through Laos and Cambodia, funneling weapons, troops, and supplies into South Vietnam. No matter how many bombs the Americans dropped, no matter how many raids were launched, the trail endured. And by 1971, the United States was running out of time. President Richard Nixon had promised the American people that U.S. combat troops would be coming home. His strategy, known as Vietnamization, meant South Vietnam's army, the ARVN, would take over the fighting. To prove they were ready, South Vietnam would have to strike deep into enemy territory without American ground troops beside them. The target, Laos. The mission, to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail once and for all. It was called Operation Lam Son 719. On paper, it looked like the perfect test of Vietnamization. 20,000 ARVN troops, backed by hundreds of U.S. helicopters, artillery, and B-52 bombers, would drive across the border, smash through enemy positions, and destroy the supply network that had kept the war alive. Success would prove that South Vietnam could stand on its own. Failure was unthinkable. But what began as a bold offensive quickly spiraled into chaos. ARVN units bogged down. North Vietnamese forces struck back with overwhelming ferocity. Helicopter after helicopter fell from the sky in flames. And what was meant to showcase South Vietnam's strength ended as a brutal demonstration of its weakness. This is the story of Operation Lam Son 719, the invasion of Laos that Nixon hoped would save his strategy and instead exposed its fatal flaws. By early 1971, the Vietnam War had dragged on for more than a decade, and the United States was desperate to find a way out. American casualties were mounting, anti-war protests were growing louder back home, and the political cost of continuing the fight was becoming unbearable. President Richard Nixon needed a plan that would reduce American involvement without simply handing victory to North Vietnam. The answer was Vietnamization. Announced in 1969, the strategy promised that the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, would gradually take over combat responsibilities while U.S. troops withdrew. In theory, South Vietnam would be trained, equipped, and motivated enough to defend itself, while America's role shifted to air support, supplies, and advisors. But there was one problem: the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This sprawling network of jungle roads, paths, tunnels, and hidden supply lines stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, feeding men and weapons directly into South Vietnam. It was the enemy's lifeline, and despite years of bombing, it was still fully operational. As long as the trail flowed, North Vietnam could continue the war indefinitely. For Nixon, this was more than a military issue, it was political. He needed proof that Vietnamization was working, proof that South Vietnam's army could carry the fight on its own. For President Nguyen Van Thieu in Saigon, the stakes were equally high. His regime had to show the South Vietnamese people and the world that ARVN was no longer dependent on American ground troops. The plan was bold and risky. South Vietnamese forces would cross into Laos, a country officially neutral but heavily infiltrated by the North Vietnamese army. The mission? Cut the trail, destroy Piabin supply bases, and cripple enemy logistics. There was one catch. By U.S. law, American ground troops could not cross into Laos. That meant the entire ground offensive would rest on ARVN's shoulders. The United States could provide helicopters, artillery, airstrikes, and logistics, but no combat boots on Laotian soil. This was the gamble of Operation Lam Son 719, to test Vietnamization not in a controlled environment, but in one of the most hostile and unforgiving battlefields of the entire war. If ARVN succeeded, it would prove that Nixon's strategy was viable, and South Vietnam could defend itself. If it failed, the entire foundation of Vietnamization would collapse, right in front of the world. On paper, Operation Lam Son 719 had a clear set of objectives. At its core, it was designed to strike directly at the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of North Vietnam's war machine. For years, this hidden highway of men and munitions had frustrated the United States. Despite the most intense bombing campaign in history, the trail continued to function, absorbing punishment, rerouting through new paths, and funneling more fighters into the South. Cutting it was the dream of every American commander. Now that mission fell to South Vietnam. The plan called for 20,000 ARVN troops to cross into southern Laos along Route 9. Their mission? 1. Destroy enemy supply depots and logistics hubs that fed the trail. 2. Seize and hold key sections of the route, severing North Vietnam's ability to reinforce its forces in the south. 3. Prove ARVN's offensive capability, demonstrating that Vietnamization was not just theory, but reality. The U.S. role would be massive but limited. Over 600 helicopters, from slick Hueys to heavy-lift Chinooks and deadly Cobra gunships, would provide air mobility. American artillery batteries near the border would offer constant fire support. B-52 bombers and fighter bombers would saturate the battlefield, but there would be no American infantry on the ground in Laos. By law, this was ARVN's fight alone. For President Thieu, the stakes were personal. A victory in Laos would show his people that South Vietnam's army was no longer dependent on American ground forces. For Nixon, the stakes were global. A successful Lam Son 719 would prove to the American public and to the world that Vietnamization was working, and U.S. withdrawal could continue without fear of collapse. But these objectives came with dangerous assumptions. The planners believed ARVN could move quickly, strike hard, and withdraw before North Vietnamese forces could react in strength. They assumed the PAVN would not commit major forces deep in Laos, and they trusted that air power could compensate for ARVN's weaknesses. They were wrong. The planners of Operation Lam Son 719 envisioned a swift, aggressive strike, but the forces assembled on both sides reveal why the operation was destined for bloodshed. Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The ground assault into Laos would be carried out entirely by ARVN. Roughly 20,000 soldiers were assigned to the mission, drawn from some of South Vietnam's best formations. The 1st Infantry Division, seasoned from battles in northern provinces. The Airborne Division, elite paratroopers known for discipline and mobility. The Marine Division, among the toughest units ARVN possessed. The 1st Armored Brigade, with American-supplied M41 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. Several Ranger groups, light infantry specialists in counterinsurgency. On paper, this was South Vietnam's finest, but beneath the surface, problems lurked. ARVN's leadership was riddled with political appointments. Many officers lacked combat initiative, and morale was shaky, especially when facing an enemy on foreign soil. United States support. While no American ground troops could cross into Laos, U.S. support was immense. Over 600 helicopters from the 101st Airborne and other aviation units would lift, supply, and cover ARVN troops. Gunships like the AH-1 Cobra prowled the skies, while Hueys ferried soldiers into landing zones under fire. Artillery batteries along the border pounded suspected enemy positions. Above it all, the thunder of B-52 bombers delivered carpet strikes, while F-4 Phantoms and A-1 Sky Raiders swooped low to strafe. American logistics kept the offensive alive, and American air crews took staggering risks to sustain it. People's Army of Vietnam facing ARVN were 40,000 to 60,000 North Vietnamese troops, Many already dug in across southern Laos. These were no guerrillas. They were regular soldiers, hardened by years of fighting. The PAVN deployed entire divisions. The 304th and 308th Divisions, veterans of major battles. The 320th Division, tasked with blocking Route 9. The 2nd Division, positioned deeper along the trail. They were backed by Soviet-supplied tanks, T-54s, PT-76, long-range artillery, and, most dangerously, dense anti-aircraft networks of 23mm and 37mm guns, surface-to-air missiles. For U.S. pilots, Laos became a killing ground. Clashing strategies. ARVN's plan: drive quickly along Route 9, set up fire bases, destroy supply caches, and withdraw before the PAVN could organize. PAVN's counter-plan: lure ARVN deeper into Laos, stretch their supply lines, then unleash overwhelming counterattacks with artillery, armor, and ambushes. It was a contest between mobility and firepower versus discipline and preparation. The South Vietnamese hoped to demonstrate independence. The North Vietnamese sought to prove the opposite. The battlefield was set, and what unfolded would test not only the strength of armies, but the very idea of Vietnamization itself. Phase 1. Crossing into Laos. At dawn on February 8th, the operation began. ARVN armored columns rolled west along Route 9, the only real highway slicing toward Laos. Behind them, waves of American helicopters lifted airborne troops toward hastily prepared landing zones. The plan was ambitious: establish fire bases inside Laos, secure Route 9, and drive deeper to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go smoothly. Fire bases were established along the border, supply lines extended, and ARVN commanders reported early successes. But the deeper ARVN moved, the more resistance stiffened. Phase 2. The PAVN countermoves. The North Vietnamese had been waiting. For months they had anticipated just such an invasion, and their response was swift. By mid-February, entire PAVN divisions began closing in on the advancing ARVN columns. Tanks rumbled through jungle tracks, artillery rained down, and ambushes erupted along the highway. The skies turned into a battlefield. U.S. helicopters, essential for mobility and resupply, flew into a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Entire platoons were pinned down as gunships darted low, exchanging rockets with hidden enemy batteries. Helicopter after helicopter spiraled out of the sky, hit by withering flak. Phase 3. Deep into the trap, ARVN airborne and Ranger units pushed farther west, establishing outposts like Firebase 31 and Firebase 30 deep inside Laos. But these positions were precarious. Isolated under constant bombardment, they quickly became magnets for PAVN assaults. Firebase 31 became the scene of a nightmare. Surrounded by superior enemy forces, its defenders endured relentless artillery and infantry assaults. Requests for reinforcement went unanswered. Helicopters could not land under such intense fire. Finally, PAVN tanks rolled in. Overrun, the survivors broke and fled. The fall of Firebase 31 was a devastating psychological blow. Phase 4. The battle for the skies. If ARVN was to survive, American helicopters had to keep flying. Pilots of the 101st Airborne, Marine squadrons, and Army aviation units carried out one of the most dangerous missions of the war. They flew constant resupply and evacuation sorties into hot LZs, where enemy guns waited. The cost was staggering. In just 6 weeks, over 100 helicopters were destroyed, and more than 600 damaged. Pilots joked grimly that Lam Son 719 stood for Laos, some of none. For those who flew, it was no joke. Casualties mounted daily. Phase 5. The turning point. By late February, ARVN's advance had stalled. The PAVN poured more divisions into Laos, overwhelming South Vietnamese units. Supply lines back to Khe Sanh were choked by ambushes. ARVN commanders began to realize the truth. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. President Thieu, fearing disaster, ordered a withdrawal. But retreat under fire was no easy task. Entire units had to fight their way back along Route 9, harried every step by PAVN artillery, tanks, and infantry. Phase 6, the chaotic withdrawal, March 1971. The withdrawal quickly devolved into chaos. Some ARVN units broke under pressure, abandoning equipment and fleeing toward the border. Others fought desperately to hold positions long enough for helicopters to extract survivors. The scenes were harrowing. Helicopters overloaded with panicked soldiers barely lifted off, bullets tearing through their fuselages. On the ground, ARVN infantry clung to skids, begging not to be left behind. American pilots risked everything, returning again and again to pluck men from collapsing firebases. Firebase Lolo, Firebase Delta, and others fell one by one. Each evacuation turned into a battle of survival. In one infamous incident, dozens of ARVN soldiers clung to a helicopter until it crashed, unable to lift the weight. Phase 7, back across the border. By early March, the survivors straggled back into South Vietnam. The invasion had lasted barely 6 weeks. The cost was catastrophic. ARVN lost thousands of men, much of its armor, and the illusion of strength. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained intact, bloodied but unbroken. For the North Vietnamese, Lamson 719 was a triumph. They had not only defended their lifeline, but humiliated the ARVN in front of the world. The human face of the battle. What made Lam Son 719 unforgettable were the images. Film footage of ARVN soldiers clinging to helicopter skids, helicopters bursting into flames mid-air, and shattered units limping back across the border told a story no press release could hide. U.S. advisors described scenes of panic, units refusing to advance, officers abandoning positions, entire battalions collapsing under fire. For many Americans, this raised the question: if South Vietnam's best troops could not hold against the North Vietnamese in Laos, how could they ever stand alone? Operation Lam Son 619 had begun as a test of Vietnamization. It ended as its funeral. ARVN's weaknesses, poor leadership, fragile morale, and dependence on U.S. air power, were laid bare for all to see. What was supposed to be a bold demonstration of independence had instead become a sobering reminder. South Vietnam could not win this war without America's boots on the ground. Every battle has its price. For Operation Lam Son 719, the cost was staggering. By the end of the operation, ARVN had suffered an estimated 7,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Entire battalions were shattered, and many of South Vietnam's best-trained units returned as broken shells of their former selves. The 1st Armored Brigade lost dozens of tanks and armored vehicles. Airborne and Ranger battalions, once elite strike forces, were decimated. Worse than the numbers was the psychological toll. Morale collapsed. Soldiers had been ordered to prove their independence, but many returned humiliated, convinced they could not stand without U.S. ground troops beside them. Although no U.S. infantry fought in Laos, the Americans paid heavily in the skies. More than 100 helicopters were destroyed and over 600 damaged. The casualty count included over 100 killed and several hundred wounded, mostly air crews. For aviation units, Lam Son 719 was one of the deadliest campaigns of the war. Estimates of PAVN losses vary wildly, ranging from 8,000 to 13,000 casualties. But the key fact remains: despite their losses, the North Vietnamese achieved their objective. The Ho Chi Minh Trail not only survived, it continued to function as the artery of their war effort. Strategically, Lam Son 719 was a failure. ARVN did not cut the trail, did not destroy PAVN bases, and did not prove Vietnamization worked. Instead, the operation exposed ARVN's weaknesses: poor leadership, fragile morale, and heavy reliance on American firepower. For the United States, the results were equally grim. Nixon had hoped for a political victory to justify continued withdrawal. Instead, the images of burning helicopters and fleeing soldiers told a different story, one of chaos and defeat. For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 was a triumph. They had stood toe-to-toe with South Vietnam's best troops, backed by American air power, and forced them into retreat. It was proof that victory was only a matter of time. When the dust settled over Laos, Operation Lam Son 719 was already being judged, not just on the battlefield, but in the political arena, and the verdicts could not have been more divided. President Nguyen Van Thieu tried desperately to frame the operation as a success. In speeches, he boasted that ARVN had inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, destroyed supply bases, and proven it could conduct large-scale operations without American infantry. Official reports from Saigon emphasized the high body counts of North Vietnamese soldiers and the destruction of supply depots. But within ARVN ranks, the mood was far darker. Soldiers who returned spoke of chaos, poor leadership, and near disaster. Many officers had shown little initiative under fire, waiting for orders that never came. Troops had panicked during the withdrawal, with some abandoning positions and equipment. The supposed success looked hollow to those who had survived the ordeal. For President Nixon, Lam Son 719 was supposed to be the proof that Vietnamization worked, a propaganda victory to show Americans that their allies could stand on their own. Instead, the images told a different story. Television footage of ARVN troops clinging desperately to helicopter skids, of abandoned vehicles littering Route 9, and of shattered battalions limping back across the border contradicted the official line. Journalists described the operation as a fiasco. Even sympathetic commentators admitted that South Vietnam had failed to achieve its goals. In Congress, critics of the war seized on Lamson 719 as evidence that Vietnamization was doomed. If ARVN's best units, with massive U.S. air support, could not succeed in Laos, how could they ever defend their own country without American combat troops? For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 was celebrated as a major victory. Propaganda broadcasts proclaimed that the puppet army of South Vietnam had been crushed. The People's Army of Vietnam had defended the Ho Chi Minh Trail and inflicted staggering losses on their enemies. Strategically, the PAVN emerged stronger. Their supply lines through Laos remained intact, and their morale soared. They had proven that even against ARVN's best troops and overwhelming U.S. air power, they could stand firm. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. For the United States, Lam Son 719 accelerated the sense of futility. Nixon pressed ahead with troop withdrawals, but with growing doubts about whether South Vietnam could ever survive alone. For South Vietnam, the operation shattered confidence. Many ARVN soldiers no longer trusted their commanders or their own ability to fight. For the North Vietnamese, Lam Son 719 confirmed what they had long believed. Time was on their side. If ARVN could collapse in 6 weeks in Laos, what would happen when the Americans were gone for good? History is often shaped less by what leaders claim and more by what the world sees. And what the world saw in Operation Lamson 719 was not strength, it was collapse. For South Vietnam, the operation was a crushing blow to morale and credibility. Lamson 719 had been intended as a showcase of ARVN's ability to wage independent war. Instead, it revealed a force plagued by fragile leadership, poor coordination, and limited endurance. These were South Vietnam's best troops, airborne, Marines, Rangers, and armored brigades, and they had faltered when asked to lead. If the elite units could not succeed, what hope did the regular infantry divisions have? For the United States, Lamson 719 struck at the very heart of Nixon's Vietnamization policy. The entire premise was that South Vietnam could defend itself with U.S. support limited to the skies, but the operation proved otherwise. Despite overwhelming American air power, ARVN could not hold ground without U.S. combat boots alongside them. To many observers in Washington, Lam Son 719 was the clearest evidence yet that South Vietnam could not survive once American forces fully withdrew. For North Vietnam, the operation was confirmation of strategy. The PAVN had absorbed massive losses but had held firm. More importantly, they had humiliated their enemy in front of the global stage. The Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to flow with men and supplies, unbroken and unstoppable. The lesson was clear. If ARVN could not destroy the trail with American support, they never would. In the long view, historians often describe Lam Son 719 as the beginning of the end for South Vietnam. It did not end the war overnight, but it stripped away illusions. From that point forward, the U.S. and Saigon both knew, whether they admitted it or not, that Vietnamization was built on sand. The legacy of Lam Son 719 is not just a military defeat, but a symbol of the limits of training, technology, and air power when the fighting spirit of an army is uncertain. It was a test South Vietnam could not pass, and its failure set the stage for the final collapse just 4 years later. Operation Lam Son 719 was supposed to be the turning point. It was meant to prove that South Vietnam's army could carry the fight into enemy territory, that Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization was working, and that the war could be won without American boots on the ground. But instead, it proved the opposite. ARVN's best troops had been thrown into Laos with overwhelming U.S. air support at their back, and they had faltered. Fire bases collapsed, helicopters fell in flames, and retreat turned into chaos. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained intact, a symbol of North Vietnam's resilience. For South Vietnam, the psychological damage was devastating. For the United States, it was a bitter lesson that no amount of air power could make up for weak allies on the ground. And for North Vietnam, it was proof that time and willpower were on their side. Lam Son 719 wasn't just a failed operation. It was the moment the world saw that Vietnamization was an illusion. What do you think? Was Lam Son 719 doomed from the start? Or could it have worked under different leadership and planning? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more untold battles of the Vietnam War. The jungle was so thick that daylight barely touched the ground. Every step forward was a gamble. One wrong move, and a hidden mine or booby trap could end a Marine's life in an instant. The steep slopes of the Quangtin Mountains shredded their boots. The heat pressed down like a weight, and the silence was never truly silent. Somewhere ahead, unseen eyes tracked their every move. It was spring 1969, and southwest of Da Nang, the most vital American base in South Vietnam, U.S. Marines were hunting an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Deep in the jungle, the North Vietnamese army had built hidden strongholds carved into the earth and bunkers buried into the hills. From these secret fortresses, they launched deadly attacks on bases, convoys, and villages, and then melted back into the shadows. To stop them, the Marines in the South Vietnamese army launched one of the toughest and most overlooked campaigns of the entire Vietnam War. For nearly 2 months, they climbed, crawled, and fought their way through brutal terrain and relentless ambushes to break the enemy's grip on the high ground. This is the untold story of Operation Oklahoma Hills, a mission fought in the shadows of the jungle, where courage, endurance, and sacrifice were the only way out. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. Over 90% of viewers who watch these videos still haven't subscribed. If you love deep dives into forgotten battles like this one, hit that button and help us reach 15,000 subscribers. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now let's go back to 1969 and into the hills. By early 1969, the war in Vietnam was entering a new and uncertain phase. After years of massive offensives and high casualties, Washington was beginning to talk about shifting responsibility to the South Vietnamese, a policy that would later be known as Vietnamization. But before that could happen, the U.S. military needed to secure key areas and deny the enemy the strongholds they relied on. At the heart of this struggle was Da Nang, the largest Marine Corps base in South Vietnam. Da Nang was more than just another airfield. It was the backbone of America's presence in I Corps Tactical Zone, the northernmost region of South Vietnam. From here, fighters and bombers struck deep into enemy territory, helicopters supplied outposts across the region, and convoys brought the food, ammunition, and fuel that kept the war effort alive. And yet, just 30 to 40 kilometers southwest of this vital hub, the enemy was watching. The Quangtin Mountains and the surrounding valleys, known collectively as the Oklahoma Hills, were a natural fortress of steep ridges, thick jungle, and hidden valleys. For years, the 2nd North Vietnamese Army Division and Viet Cong Main Force units had turned this remote region into a network of bases, supply depots, and training areas. From here, they launched ambushes on U.S. patrols, attacked isolated outposts, and struck at supply convoys heading in and out of Da Nang. American forces had tried to root them out before. Operations like Taylor Common and Meade River had cleared enemy units and destroyed camps, but they were never enough. The NVA and VC would simply melt into the jungle, cross into Laos or Cambodia, and return weeks later to rebuild what was lost. By March 1969, intelligence reports showed a worrying pattern. Enemy units were once again massing in the Quezon region, rebuilding bunkers, and preparing for new attacks. Da Nang, and the entire southern approach to Acor, was at risk if nothing was done. Marine commanders knew they couldn't allow that to happen. If the enemy maintained a sanctuary so close to their most important base, every convoy, patrol, and village in the region would remain under threat. The solution was clear. Launch a massive search and destroy operation deep into the Oklahoma hills and wipe out the NVA presence, once and for all. It would be no small task. The Marines would be fighting not just the enemy, but the unforgiving terrain itself. The jungle would hide ambushes. The steep slopes would slow down every advance. And the enemy, as always, would be determined, experienced, and deadly. But the stakes were too high to ignore. The future of Da Nang and the entire American war effort in the region depended on breaking the enemy's hold on those mountains. With fresh intelligence confirming heavy enemy activity in the Quezon Mountains, Marine commanders knew they had no time to waste. The goal was clear: penetrate deep into the Oklahoma hills, destroy enemy base areas, and cut off their ability to threaten Da Nang. To do this, they would launch one of the most ambitious joint operations of 1969. The mission was named Operation Oklahoma Hills, and it would be a combined effort between the United States Marine Corps and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. The responsibility for leading the assault fell to the 1st Marine Division, a veteran force that had fought some of the fiercest battles of the war. They would work alongside the 51st ARVN Regiment, which would secure key routes and block potential enemy escape paths. The plan called for a massive coordinated sweep through the mountainous region southwest of Da Nang. The Marines would push westward and southward from their positions near the coast, while ARVN units moved north from their bases further inland. Together, they aimed to trap and destroy the communist units hiding in the hills. Among the Marine units tasked with the mission were battle-hardened battalions like the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines 3/5, and the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines 1/7, units known for their endurance and combat effectiveness in some of the toughest operations of the war. These Marines would be the tip of the spear, leading search and destroy patrols deep into the jungle and assaulting enemy positions head-on. But planners knew this operation would not be easy. The Oklahoma hills were notorious for their rugged terrain and dense jungle, perfect conditions for guerrilla warfare. Helicopters would struggle to land. Vehicles could not penetrate most of the area. This meant the Marines would be on foot, carrying heavy packs and weapons, often climbing steep slopes under sweltering heat, all while knowing that every bush or tree line could hide an ambush. To overcome these challenges, the plan relied on combined arms coordination. Artillery and close air support would pound suspected enemy positions before ground forces moved in. Helicopters would ferry troops into remote landing zones where no roads existed. ARVN units would position themselves along escape routes, preventing the NVA from slipping away into the deeper mountains. On March 26, 1969, after weeks of planning and reconnaissance, Operation Oklahoma Hills was launched. Hundreds of Marines began pushing into the thick jungle southwest of Da Nang, supported by ARVN troops on the flanks and U.S. aircraft circling overhead. What awaited them in the Oklahoma Hills was more than just a fight against the enemy. It was a battle against the terrain, the climate, and a ruthless opponent who knew every inch of the ground and who was determined to defend it. At dawn on March 26, 1969, the 1st Marine patrols stepped off into the jungle southwest of Da Nang. The long-anticipated Operation Oklahoma Hills had begun. Ahead of them stretched the unforgiving terrain of the Quezon Mountains, steep ridge lines rising like walls from the jungle floor, valleys so narrow they swallowed sunlight, and dense vegetation so thick that visibility rarely stretched beyond a few meters. It was the kind of ground that favored the enemy, and the Marines knew it. Progress was slow from the start. The terrain alone was a formidable opponent. Heavy packs, weapons, and ammunition made every climb exhausting. Mud and tangled roots tripped men at every step. In some places, the slopes were so steep that Marines had to climb on their hands and knees, dragging themselves and their gear upward under the weight of the humid air. But the landscape was only part of the danger. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC, had no intention of meeting the Marines in a pitched battle. Instead, they used the terrain to their advantage, relying on guerrilla tactics honed over years of fighting. Snipers fired from hidden positions before melting away into the jungle. Small squads launched sudden ambushes from behind tree lines, disappearing before the reinforcements could arrive. And everywhere there were traps. Booby traps and mines were scattered across trails, riverbanks, and even inside abandoned huts. Some were crude but deadly, sharpened bamboo stakes coated with poison, hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves. Others were far more sophisticated, using explosives and tripwires triggered by the slightest touch. Each step forward demanded total focus. A single careless move could cost a man his life or his legs. The Marines pushed forward regardless. Patrols probed enemy positions, engineers swept for mines, and artillery and airstrikes softened suspected strongholds before ground forces closed in. Helicopter gunships hovered overhead, ready to unleash rockets at a moment's notice. But even getting helicopters into the fight was a challenge. The thick jungle canopy made landings difficult and dangerous, forcing pilots to find narrow clearings or hover just long enough for Marines to jump out before pulling away. Despite these obstacles, the operation advanced. Early patrols uncovered small enemy camps and supply points hidden deep in the forest. Documents seized in these raids revealed valuable intelligence, details about the 2nd NVA Division's movements and the locations of larger base areas further west. Each skirmish, each patrol, was a step deeper into the enemy's heartland. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Marines suffered losses from ambushes and booby traps, but they gave as good as they got. Enemy fighters caught in the open were cut down by rifle fire and airstrikes. Entire squads were wiped out when Marine units caught them trying to slip away through the valleys. As the days turned into weeks, the Marines continued to grind forward through the dense jungle. The terrain that had once seemed impenetrable was slowly yielding its secrets. They were getting closer to the enemy's main base areas, deeper into the Oklahoma Hills complex, where the North Vietnamese had built a network of bunkers, tunnels, and supply depots. The hardest part of the operation was still ahead. The enemy was retreating deeper into the hills, luring the Marines into the core of their defensive system. It was here in the heart of the mountains that Operation Oklahoma Hills would become a brutal contest of endurance and firepower, a fight for control over the hidden fortresses that had fueled the communist war effort for years. By early April 1969, weeks into Operation Oklahoma Hills, the Marines had clawed their way deep into enemy territory. The scattered ambushes and sniper fire of the opening days began to give way to something far more dangerous, signs of well-organized enemy defenses buried deep within the hills. Patrols started finding the first hints: a hidden cooking area here, a camouflage tunnel entrance there. Then came bigger discoveries: storage bunkers packed with rice, ammunition, and medical supplies. The deeper they pushed, the clearer it became that they weren't just sweeping a few guerrilla camps. They were closing in on a major North Vietnamese base complex, one that had been hidden for years in the folds of the Quangtin Mountains. The Marines advanced cautiously, knowing they were entering the enemy's heartland. The bunkers they encountered were far more elaborate than anything they had seen before. Dug deep into hillsides and reinforced with logs, they were nearly impervious to small arms fire. Some were connected by tunnel networks stretching hundreds of meters, allowing the enemy to move unseen, reappear behind Marine lines, or vanish entirely when outgunned. These hidden strongholds were more than just defensive positions. They were the backbone of the communist war effort in this part of Quang Province. Inside, Marines found field hospitals, training areas, command posts, and enormous stockpiles of weapons and explosives. It was clear that the 2nd NVA Division had used these bases to plan and launch countless attacks against Da Nang and surrounding villages. But the NVA wasn't about to abandon them without a fight. In mid-April, Marine patrols closing in on one such complex were met with intense automatic fire from concealed bunkers. The jungle erupted in gunfire as Marines hit the ground and called in air support. Jets screamed overhead, dropping bombs and napalm on the hillsides, while artillery batteries from distant fire bases pounded the ridges with high explosive shells. Even so, many of the enemy bunkers withstood the bombardment, forcing Marines to assault them directly. These close-quarters battles were some of the most brutal of the operation. Marines would flank a bunker under covering fire, toss grenades into firing ports, and rush forward as explosions ripped through the air. In some cases, they had to crawl through narrow tunnels, weapons ready, never knowing if an enemy soldier was waiting just a few feet ahead. Every captured position revealed another, deeper, better hidden, more heavily defended. The fighting was relentless. The NVA knew the terrain intimately and used every advantage it offered. They struck from hidden firing holes and spider holes, vanished into tunnels, and reappeared behind Marine patrols. Booby traps laced with explosives slowed every advance. The Marines responded with overwhelming firepower, calling in helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, and close air support to smash enemy fortifications before moving in to clear what was left. To counter the enemy's mobility, Marine commanders began using a new tactic known as saturation patrols. Instead of relying on large sweeping movements, they broke their forces into smaller units and sent them in all directions simultaneously. The idea was to deny the NVA the space and time to regroup, forcing them into firefights where they were weakest. Meanwhile, ARVN forces tightened the noose from the south, blocking escape routes and capturing fighters attempting to flee. Their presence ensured that any enemy unit trying to slip out of the mountains would run straight into a wall of South Vietnamese troops. By late April, the Marines had destroyed dozens of bunker systems and uncovered massive stockpiles of supplies. Each discovery struck a blow to the NVA's ability to sustain operations near Da Nang. Still, resistance continued. The enemy refused to give up the fight easily, and every valley cleared revealed another pocket of resistance deeper in the hills. But the momentum had shifted. The Marines now controlled much of the Oklahoma Hills region, and the NVA was running out of ground to stand on. Their once secure mountain strongholds were being dismantled piece by piece. The final stage of the operation was at hand, and it would finish what weeks of relentless fighting had begun. By early May 1969, the tide of Operation Oklahoma Hills had fully turned. The once formidable enemy base areas were now shattered, their bunkers destroyed, and their supply lines cut to pieces. The Marines and ARVN had spent over a month pushing deeper into the Khe Son Mountains, dismantling everything the North Vietnamese army had built there. But the mission wasn't over yet. There was still work to do, and the enemy wasn't ready to give up without a final fight. The deeper the Marines pushed, the more desperate the NVA became. Small units launched fierce rearguard actions, firing from concealed positions, and then retreating into the dense jungle. Snipers harassed patrols from tree lines and ridges, trying to slow the advance. Booby traps and mines, now laid in even greater numbers, claimed more lives as the enemy tried to inflict maximum casualties before slipping away. But by now, the Marines had adapted. Their tactics had evolved, and their determination only hardened. They moved deliberately, clearing every ridge and valley step by step, supported by artillery, close air support, and helicopter gunships that hammered suspected positions before ground troops moved in. Engineers swept the trails for mines while infantry squads fanned out to cut off escape routes. It was during this phase that the Marines uncovered some of the largest and most elaborate bunker systems of the entire operation. Entire networks, some with dozens of interconnected fighting positions, storage rooms, and tunnel entrances, were found carved deep into the hillsides. Many of them were now abandoned, hastily evacuated as U.S. and ARVN forces closed in. Inside, Marines found stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and food, all left behind in the enemy's rush to escape. Still, not all had fled. Pockets of die-hard resistance fought bitterly to the end, refusing to surrender even as their situation became hopeless. In several intense engagements, Marine patrols stumbled into well-camouflaged enemy positions, triggering firefights at ranges so close that grenades and bayonets were often the deciding factor. But each skirmish ended the same way, the NVA pulling back, unable to hold their ground against the relentless pressure. The enemy's strategy had shifted from holding territory to survival. Many NVA units began slipping westward, deeper into the mountains and across the border toward Laos, abandoning their once secure bases. Intercepted radio traffic revealed confusion and frustration among enemy commanders, who struggled to reorganize scattered units and salvage what they could of their shattered logistics network. By the third week of May, resistance had dwindled to scattered sniping and isolated ambushes. The operation had achieved its goal. The Oklahoma Hills base complex was dismantled, its bunkers and tunnels destroyed, and its ability to support operations against Da Nang crippled. With the mission complete and the area cleared, Marine and ARVN commanders decided to bring the operation to a close. On May 22, 1969, after nearly 2 months of continuous fighting, Operation Oklahoma Hills officially ended. The Marines had fought their way through some of the most unforgiving terrain in Vietnam, endured relentless ambushes and traps, and shattered a major enemy stronghold just kilometers from one of America's most important bases. The price had been high. Dozens of Marines had lost their lives and hundreds were wounded, but their sacrifices had denied the enemy one of its most valuable sanctuaries and bought crucial time for the next phase of the war, a phase in which South Vietnamese forces would begin to take the lead. The Oklahoma Hills had been cleared. The enemy was gone, for now. When the guns finally fell silent in late May 1969, Operation Oklahoma Hills stood as one of the most successful joint campaigns of the year. For nearly 2 months, U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese troops had fought their way through some of the most hostile terrain in the country, and they had achieved exactly what they set out to do. The results spoke for themselves. By the end of the operation, Allied forces had killed an estimated 589 enemy soldiers and captured more than 40. Dozens of others were wounded or forced to retreat deeper into the mountains, abandoning their bases and equipment. The Marines had uncovered and destroyed hundreds of bunkers, tunnels, and fortified positions, more than 500 in total. Massive stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and food were seized or destroyed, cutting deeply into the enemy's ability to operate in the region. But the victory had not come without cost. The Marines lost 44 men killed and around 250 wounded in the course of the operation. Many of these casualties were caused not by open combat, but by booby traps, mines, and sudden ambushes. A grim reminder of the brutal and unforgiving nature of the war in Vietnam. Each life lost was a painful sacrifice in a campaign fought far from home, in terrain that seemed to fight back just as hard as the enemy did. Strategically, the operation was a clear success. The destruction of the NVA and VC base areas in the Oklahoma Hills significantly reduced the threat to Da Nang and the surrounding districts. For months afterward, enemy attacks in the area dropped sharply, and U.S. convoys and patrols could move with far greater security. The enemy's logistical network southwest of Da Nang had been crippled, and their ability to launch large-scale operations in the region was severely weakened. Yet even in victory, there were sobering lessons. The Marines knew the NVA was patient and resourceful. History had shown that even after devastating losses, they often returned to the same regions months later, rebuilding what had been destroyed and resuming operations. The jungles and mountains of Vietnam could hide entire armies, and without a permanent presence, no area ever stayed secure for long. Still, Operation Oklahoma Hills marked a turning point. It demonstrated that U.S. and ARVN forces could coordinate large-scale operations effectively, combining mobility, firepower, and determination to root out deeply entrenched enemy forces. It was also one of the last major ground offensives led by U.S. Marines before the gradual withdrawal of American troops began under President Nixon's Vietnamization policy later that year. For the Marines who fought there, the operation was more than just a military success. It was a testament to endurance. They had faced an invisible enemy in some of the harshest terrain imaginable and had overcome every obstacle placed in their path. The mountains that had once sheltered the enemy now stood silent, their tunnels destroyed, their bunkers empty. The Oklahoma Hills had been cleared. Da Nang was safer. And the Marines had proven once again that no terrain, no trap, and no enemy could break their resolve. Operation Oklahoma Hills might not be as well known as battles like Hue, Khe Sanh, or Hamburger Hill, but for the Marines who fought there, and for the broader course of the war, it was a mission that mattered deeply. It was a hard, grinding campaign fought not for headlines or glory, but for control of the ground that shaped the war's outcome. The operation highlighted one of the most enduring truths of the Vietnam War. Terrain was as much an enemy as the soldiers themselves. The Quang Son Mountains were tailor-made for guerrilla warfare, steep, remote, and covered in dense jungle. Every bunker destroyed, every tunnel collapsed, and every path cleared had been won through sweat, blood, and determination. It showed that even with overwhelming firepower and technology, victory in Vietnam often came down to the grit of small infantry units, fighting yard by yard. It also underscored the adaptability and resilience of the U.S. Marine Corps and their South Vietnamese allies. Faced with hidden bunkers, deadly traps, and an enemy that refused to fight conventionally, they adjusted their tactics, relied on small unit patrols, and combined infantry assaults with artillery and air support to break the enemy's hold. Their coordination with ARVN units during the operation also demonstrated how joint efforts could deliver results, a critical lesson as the U.S. prepared to hand over more responsibility under the Vietnamization strategy. At the same time, Operation Oklahoma Hills revealed the limitations of even the most successful operations. While the Marines had destroyed the NVA's strongholds and severely disrupted their logistics, they could not permanently eliminate the enemy presence without a lasting occupation of the region. Within months, elements of the 2nd NVA Division would begin to filter back into the hills, rebuilding some of what had been lost. It was a pattern repeated across Vietnam, one that reflected the deeper challenges of a war where control of territory was often temporary. Yet for all its difficulties, the operation achieved what it set out to do. It secured Da Nang's southwestern approaches, protected vital supply routes, and gave U.S. and South Vietnamese forces the breathing room they needed to prepare for the next phase of the conflict. For a time, the Oklahoma Hills, once a sanctuary for enemy forces, became a dangerous place for the NVA to operate. And perhaps most importantly, Operation Oklahoma Hills stands as a testament to the courage and perseverance of the men who fought there. They endured punishing terrain, relentless ambushes, and a cunning enemy, and they never wavered. Their efforts might not have grabbed the headlines, but they were essential to the larger mission. They fought a hidden war in the shadows of the mountains, and through their sacrifice, they delivered a victory that mattered. More than 5 decades later, the story of Operation Oklahoma Hills remains one of the Vietnam War's forgotten chapters, a reminder that history is often written not just in the famous battles, but in the relentless, grinding campaigns fought far from the cameras, in jungles and hills where victory was measured one ridge, one bunker, and one patrol at a time. The story of Operation Oklahoma Hills is more than just a chapter in the Vietnam War. It's a story of courage, endurance, and sacrifice. It's about young Marines and South Vietnamese soldiers who pushed into unforgiving terrain, faced an enemy they could barely see, and refused to quit no matter how hard the fight became. For nearly 2 months, they battled not just the North Vietnamese army, but the land itself, the steep mountains, the choking jungle, and the deadly traps that waited behind every tree. They dismantled an enemy stronghold, secured one of America's most vital bases, and proved once again that determination and teamwork could achieve the impossible. And yet, like so many battles in Vietnam, Oklahoma Hills is often forgotten, buried beneath the names of more famous fights. But it shouldn't be, because every patrol, every bunker cleared, and every hill taken mattered. Their sacrifices made a difference. If you learned something new today, let us know in the comments. Had you ever heard of Operation Oklahoma Hills before this video? And if you love these deep dives into forgotten battles and untold stories of the Vietnam War, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Over 90% of viewers still aren't subscribed, and your support helps us keep these stories alive. We're on a mission to reach 15,000 subscribers, and with your help, we'll get there. So join us, because there are many more hidden battles, forgotten heroes, and untold stories still to come. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
And most of them did it without recognition, without medals, and without the country ever knowing their names. They fought in jungles that didn't officially exist. They carried out missions that were never supposed to be acknowledged. And when they came home, there was nothing waiting for them. No parade, no thank you, just silence. But their stories are real. Their sacrifice was real, and they deserved better than to be forgotten. That's why this channel exists. If you made it to the end of this documentary, you already understand why these stories matter. So here's what I'm asking you to do right now. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because every new subscriber, every share, that's how these forgotten soldiers reach one more person. That's how we make sure their sacrifice is never erased again. These men gave everything. The least we can do is remember them, subscribe, like, share, and we'll keep telling the stories that history left behind. Until next time.